The orange flames danced against the midnight sky, casting twisted shadows across the empty faculty parking lot. Glass exploded outward as the fire consumed the dashboard, the heat so intense it warped the metal frame. But through the smoke and chaos, a figure stood motionless in the darkness, watching his life burn with an expression that would have frozen blood. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. David Chun had seen fires before. House fires where families trapped inside screamed for help. Warehouse fires where suspects tried to destroy evidence. Car bombs that left nothing but twisted steel and memories. But this fire was different. This fire was personal. And the three silhouettes running away through the trees had no idea they'd just made the worst mistake of their lives. The sirens were already approaching, red and blue lights cutting through the night. David pulled out his phone, the screen illuminating a face that looked carved from granite. His fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced precision, typing a message that would change everything. Then he deleted it. Some conversations. Required face-to-face meetings. As the fire department arrived and began their work, David walked toward the school building. His keycard still worked, even at midnight. Security cameras tracked his movement, but David knew exactly where each one was positioned, their blind spots, their recording schedules. Old habits from a previous life. The hallway stretched before him, fluorescent emergency lighting casting everything in an eerie green glow. His footsteps echoed off polished floors as he made his way to room 127. Inside his classroom, photographs covered one wall. Students from 5 years of teaching, their faces bright with possibility. But tonight, David wasn't looking at the students. He was studying the shadows behind them, the faces in the background, the ones who thought they were invisible. 3 days earlier, the morning sun had streamed through those same classroom windows. As David Chun prepared for another day at Lincoln High School in Portland, Oregon. At 42, he carried himself with a posture that spoke of discipline and authority, though he'd traded his tactical gear for khakis and button-down shirts. His salt and pepper hair was trimmed military short, and his eyes held the kind of alertness that never fully switched off. Room 127 was his domain now. Maps covered the walls, showing everything from ancient civilizations to modern geopolitical boundaries. David had arranged the desks in a semicircle, breaking away from traditional rows. He believed education should be a conversation, not a lecture. But that philosophy was about to be tested by students who had never learned the meaning of respect. The first bell rang at 7:30, and students began filtering in with the casual indifference of teenagers everywhere. Most took their assigned seats without issue, pulling out notebooks and settling in for another day of required learning. But 3 students entered like they owned the place, their body language screaming entitlement and barely contained aggression. Tyler Morrison led the pack, a 17-year-old whose father owned half the commercial real estate in Portland. He had the kind of confidence that came from never facing real consequences, his designer clothes and expensive watch serving as armor against accountability. Behind him came Jake Sullivan, built like a linebacker, but with the mean streak of someone who enjoyed using his size to intimidate. The third number of their group, Alex Hartwell, was the strategist, quieter but with cold eyes that calculated angles and weaknesses. They took seats in the back corner, not because they'd been assigned there, but because it gave them the best view of the classroom and the teacher who dared to challenge them. David noticed their positioning immediately, his tactical training automatically assessing the sightlines and potential threats. But he was a teacher now, not a SWAT commander, so he simply began his lesson. Today we're discussing the fall of the Roman Empire, David announced, turning to write key dates on the whiteboard. Can anyone tell me what factors contributed to Rome's decline? A hand shot up from the middle of the classroom. Sarah Chun, no relation despite the shared surname, was one of his best students. Political corruption played a major role, didn't it? When leaders became more concerned with personal gain than serving the people. Excellent point, Sarah. Corruption at the top often leads to systemic failure. David's eyes briefly met Tyler's in the back row. When those in power believe rules don't apply to them, it creates a culture of lawlessness that eventually destroys everything. Tyler shifted in his seat, picking up on the subtle message. He pulled out his phone, fingers moving across the screen with deliberate defiance. David noticed but continued teaching, his voice never changing tone or pace. The Romans also struggled with economic inequality. A small elite controlled vast wealth while ordinary citizens suffered. This created resentment and instability. David moved between the desks, his presence commanding attention from everyone except the three in the back corner. "Mr. Morrison," David said, stopping beside Tyler's desk. "Since you seem so engaged with your vice, perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts on how economic disparity contributed to Roman decline?" Tyler looked up with the lazy confidence of someone who'd never been held accountable. "I wouldn't know. My family's always had money, so economic problems aren't really my thing." A few students shifted uncomfortably. Everyone knew the Morrison family's influence extended far beyond real estate. They funded political campaigns, sat on the school board, and had their names on half the buildings in downtown Portland. "Interesting perspective," David replied, his voice carrying the kind of calm that experienced officers use before making arrests. "But understanding history requires us to examine experiences beyond our own. Otherwise, we repeat the same mistakes." "Are you calling my family a mistake?" Tyler's voice carried a challenge that made the classroom go silent. David met his gaze without blinking. "I'm suggesting that history teaches us humility. Every empire that believed it was untouchable eventually fell. Every family that thought wealth made them untouchable eventually learned otherwise." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Jake Sullivan's hands clenched into fists, while Alex Hartwell watched the exchange with calculating eyes. David stood perfectly still, his posture relaxed but ready, a stance that had served him well during 12 years of high-risk operations. "My father doesn't like teachers who get too big for their britches," Tyler said, his voice carrying implications that everyone understood. "Your father is welcome to schedule a conference any time," David replied. "I believe in open communication with parents who are genuinely concerned about their children's education." After class, Tyler lingered while other students filed out. Jake and Alex flanked him, creating a barrier between David and the door. It was an intimidation tactic David had seen countless times, usually right before things turned violent. "You don't know who you're messing with," Tyler said, stepping closer to David's desk. "Teachers who cross my family don't tend to last long." At Lincoln High, David finished packing his materials with deliberate calm. "Mr. Morrison, I've dealt with actual threats from actual dangerous people. If you have concerns about your grade or my teaching methods, I encourage you to discuss them with Principal Martinez. If you're trying to intimidate me, I suggest you reconsider your approach." "We'll see about that," Jake Sullivan spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the promise of violence. David looked at each of them in turn, his gaze steady and unimpressed. "Gentlemen, class is dismissed. I have a faculty meeting to attend." They left, but their body language promised this wasn't over. David waited until their footsteps faded before pulling out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found a number he hadn't called in months. Detective Maria Santos, Portland Police Bureau. They'd worked together during his SWAT days, and she owed him several favors. "Santos, Maria, it's David Chen. I might need some advice." "The teacher or the ex-tactical commander?" "Probably both." That afternoon, David's car wouldn't start. The engine turned over but died immediately, again and again. A quick inspection revealed sugar in the gas tank, a juvenile but effective form of sabotage. As he called for a tow truck, David noticed Tyler Morrison's BMW parked across the street. 3 figures inside watching his predicament with obvious satisfaction. The next morning brought a new escalation. David arrived to find his classroom. Windows covered in graffiti, vulgar words and threats painted in red that looked disturbingly like blood, but smelled like cheap paint. Principal Martinez arrived within minutes, her face pale with concern. "David, I'm so sorry. I've already called maintenance to clean this up." Elena Martinez had been principal for 15 years, long enough to understand the delicate balance between education and politics that kept schools running. She was a good woman caught in an impossible position, trying to serve students while navigating the influence of wealthy families who could destroy budgets with a single phone call. "Any ideas you might have done this?" David asked, though they both knew the answer. "I can't make accusations without proof," Elena said carefully. "But I can increase security patrols and install additional cameras. The Morrison family's donations fund those security systems, don't they?" Elena's silence was enough. David understood the position she was in, just as he understood that he was on his own in this fight. It was a familiar feeling, one that took him back to nights when backup was 20 minutes away and suspects were armed and desperate. The day passed without incident, but David felt eyes on him constantly. Tyler and his crew maintained their distance, but made sure he knew they were watching. They'd positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the school, creating a network of surveillance that would have impressed his old tactical team. These weren't ordinary bullies acting on impulse. They were organized, calculating, and patient. After school, David stayed late to grade papers and plan lessons. The building grew quiet as staff and students headed home, leaving only the occasional footstep of custodial workers and the hum of fluorescent lights. David was used to solitude, to the hypervigilance that came from years of dangerous work. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt like a trap being set. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Should have listened. "Tonight you learn respect." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. David screenshot the message and forwarded it to Detective Santos, along with a brief explanation. Then he gathered his materials and headed for the parking lot, every sense alert for danger. The lot was mostly empty, his rental car sitting alone. Under a flickering light that cast twisted shadows across the asphalt dot as he approached his vehicle, David noticed something that made his blood run cold. The smell of gasoline hung heavy in the air, and liquid pooled beneath the car's undercarriage. But this wasn't a leak from the gas tank. Someone had doused the entire vehicle in an accelerant, creating a bomb waiting for ignition. David backed away slowly, pulling out his phone to call 911, when he heard the sound of running footsteps. 3 figures emerged from behind the dumpsters, their faces covered with bandanas but their builds unmistakable. Tyler Morrison, Jake Sullivan, and Alex Hartwell, armed with baseball bats and the kind of confidence that came from believing their family connections made them untouchable. "Too late to run now, teacher," Tyler called out, his voice muffled but recognizable. David's tactical training kicked in automatically. 3 attackers, armed with blunt weapons, positioned to prevent his escape to the school building. The gasoline-soaked car behind him meant fire was part of their plan. Classic pincer movement designed to trap and terrorize, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed David Chun was just another teacher, just another victim to be intimidated into silence. They had no idea they were facing a man who'd spent 12 years breaking down doors, neutralizing armed suspects, and protecting innocent people from exactly this kind of violence. "Gentlemen," David said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "you have one chance to walk away. I suggest you take it." Tyler laughed. a sound that echoed off the empty buildings. "You're not giving orders anymore, old man. Tonight, you learn what happens when you disrespect the Morrison family." He pulled a lighter from his pocket, the flame dancing in the darkness like a promise of destruction. The message was clear: submit or watch everything burn. David Chun had faced armed terrorists, drug dealers with military-grade weapons, and domestic terrorists with nothing left to lose. He'd been shot at, threatened, and cornered by people far more dangerous than 3 spoiled teenagers with baseball bats. But he'd never faced anyone stupid enough to bring fire to a fight with a man who'd spent his career saving lives. The flame flickered in Tyler's hand as he approached the gasoline-soaked car. David watched, calculating distances and angles, reading body language and positioning. His hands remained steady at his sides, but every muscle was coiled and ready. "Last chance," David said quietly. Tyler's response was to step closer to the car, lighter held high like a torch. The gasoline vapors would ignite in seconds, creating an explosion that would destroy evidence and potentially kill anyone nearby. It was no longer about intimidation or respect. It was about 3 young men who'd convinced themselves that money and connections made them untouchable, about to learn that some people couldn't be bought, threatened, or burned into submission. The lighter moved toward the car. David moved toward Tyler, and in the space between flame and fuel, between arrogance and consequence, a teacher was about to remind 3 bullies that he'd once been something far more dangerous than they could imagine. 6 months earlier, David Chun had walked through the gates of Lincoln High School for the first time, carrying a worn leather briefcase and the kind of nervous energy that came with starting over. The morning fog rolled off the Columbia River, shrouding Portland in its familiar gray embrace, as David tried to reconcile his new reality with the life he'd left behind. The transition from SWAT commander to high school teacher wasn't something they covered in career counseling. Most people didn't go from coordinating tactical operations to explaining the Enlightenment to 16-year-olds. But David had his reasons that lived in the space between sleepless nights and therapy sessions, between the weight of decisions made in split seconds and the faces of people he couldn't save. Principal Elena Martinez had greeted him that first day with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been trying to fill a difficult position for months. The previous history teacher had left mid-semester, citing irreconcilable differences with certain families in his resignation letter. Elena hadn't elaborated, but David understood that Lincoln High operated under unspoken rules that had nothing to do with education. "Your background is unique," Elena had said during their initial meeting, reviewing his file. 12 years with Portland Police, 8 of those with SWAT, commendations for valor, expert marksman ratings, specialized training in crisis negotiation. Why teaching? David had given her the sanitized version, the one he'd rehearsed for months. He wanted to give back to the community, to shape young minds, to find meaning beyond law enforcement. All true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth lived in a case file labeled Officer Involved, shooting number 2019 to 847, and a 17-year-old kid who'd made one bad decision too many. Lincoln High School sat in the heart of Portland's Pearl District, a testament to urban renewal and the kind of money that transformed neighborhoods overnight. The building itself was a blend of historic brick and modern glass, funded by donations from families whose names adorned plaques throughout the hallways. The Morrison Family Learning Center, the Sullivan Athletic Complex, the Hartwell Technology Lab. Money had a voice at Lincoln High, and it spoke loudly. David's first month had been a learning curve steeper than anything in his tactical training. Teenagers were unpredictable in ways that armed suspects weren't. They tested boundaries constantly, probed for weaknesses, and formed alliances that shifted daily. But they also surprised him with moments of genuine insight, questions that cut to the heart of complex issues, and the kind of idealism that made him remember why he'd wanted to serve and protect in the first place. Room 127 had become his sanctuary. Walls covered with maps that told the story of human civilization's rise and fall. He'd arranged the space to encourage discussion, breaking down the traditional barrier between teacher and student. Most kids responded well to being treated like adults, to having their opinions valued and their questions taken seriously. Most kids, but not all. Tyler Morrison had announced himself on day 3 with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never been told no. He'd walked into class 15 minutes late, designer coffee in hand, and taken a seat without apology or explanation. When David had asked him to explain his tardiness, Tyler had simply shrugged and said, "Traffic," as if the word itself was explanation enough. "In the future, Mr. Morrison, please plan to arrive on time. Class begins at 8:15, not 8:30. Tyler had looked at him with the kind of amused disdain usually reserved for service workers and said, "I'll keep that in mind." The message was clear. Rules were suggestions for people like Tyler Morrison. David had dealt with plenty of entitled individuals during his police career, but they'd usually been adults with arrest records and outstanding warrants. Tyler was 17, technically still a child, but carrying himself with the confidence of someone who'd inherited power without earning responsibility. His clothes cost more than most teachers' monthly salaries. His watch was worth more than David's car, and his attitude suggested he viewed school as an inconvenient obligation between more important activities. Jake Sullivan was Tyler's enforcer, a role he'd clearly embraced since childhood. At 6'3" and 220 pounds, he'd been recruited by college football scouts since his sophomore year, but his real talent lay in intimidation. Jake used his size the way other people use tools, precisely and with clear intent. He never started fights, technically, but somehow other students found themselves backing down from confrontations they couldn't remember starting. David had watched Jake operate for weeks before understanding the strategy. A shoulder bump in the hallway that sent smaller students stumbling. Standing just a little too close during conversations, using his height to loom over anyone who disagreed with him. Cracking his knuckles during tense moments, a sound that carried implications everyone understood. Jake Sullivan was Tyler Morrison's hammer, and every problem looked like a nail. Alex Hartwell completed their trinity with the kind of quiet intelligence that made him the most dangerous of the three. Where Tyler was flashy and Jake was obvious, Alex operated in shadows, collecting information and identifying leverage points with the precision of a natural strategist. He rarely spoke in class, but when he did, his comments revealed a sharp mind twisted toward manipulation rather than learning. David had recognized the dynamic immediately. In his SWAT days, he'd encountered similar groups among organized crime families. Tyler was the heir apparent, Jake was the muscle, and Alex was the consigliere. They operated with the same territorial awareness, the same casual violence, and the same assumption that normal rules didn't apply to them. The only difference was age and the absence of firearms. The first real test had come during a lesson on World War II, specifically the Nuremberg trials on the concept of moral responsibility. David had been discussing how ordinary people became complicit in atrocities, how good people convinced themselves that following orders absolved them of ethical responsibility. The guards at concentration camps often claimed they were just doing their jobs, David explained, writing key points on the whiteboard. They argued that questioning orders wasn't their place, that they were just following the chain of command. But the judges at Nuremberg established an important principle. Following orders is not an excuse for moral cowardice. Sarah Chun had raised her hand, as she often did. But what about situations where speaking up puts you at risk? What if standing up for what's right means losing your job or worse? Excellent question, Sarah. That's exactly the kind of moral complexity the Nuremberg judges grappled with. They ultimately decided that some things are more important than personal safety, that some lines can't be crossed regardless of consequences. Tyler had snorted, a sound of derision carried across the quiet classroom. Easy to say when you're not the one taking the risks. Some of us have more to lose than others. David had turned to face him, recognizing the challenge for what it was. Mr. Morrison, are you suggesting that moral principles should be flexible based on economic status? I'm suggesting that people with real responsibilities can't afford to be heroes. Some of us have families to think about, businesses to consider. Making grand moral gestures is a luxury for people who don't have anything real at stake. The classroom had gone silent, students sensing the tension building between teacher and student. David had felt the familiar calm that preceded high-stress operations, the mental clarity that came from recognizing a situation about to turn dangerous. Interesting perspective, David had replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. But history shows us that the people with the most to lose are often the ones with the greatest responsibility to act. The wealthy industrialists who funded the Nazi Party thought they were protecting their interests. The government officials who looked the other way thought they were preserving stability. But in the end, they discovered that moral cowardice has its own price. Tyler's face had flushed red, and David had seen Jake Sullivan's hands clench into fists. The message had been received and understood. David Chun wasn't going to be intimidated by money, influence, or implied threats. After class, the three had lingered, creating a barrier between David and the door. It was a tactic David recognized from gang encounters, a way of asserting control over space and limiting options for retreat. You know, Tyler had said, his voice carrying a casual menace, my father sits on the school board. He takes a personal interest in the quality of education his donations are funding. Your father is welcome to observe my classes anytime. David had replied, beginning to pack his materials with deliberate calm. I believe in transparency and accountability. Maybe he should. Maybe he should take a close look at teachers who seem more interested in political indoctrination than actual education. David had finished packing and stood to face the three students. In that moment, his bearing had shifted slightly, revealing hints of the tactical commander he'd once been. His posture straightened, his gaze sharpened, and something in his presence had made all three boys take an unconscious step backward. Gentlemen, if you have concerns about my curriculum or teaching methods, I encourage you to discuss them with Principal Martinez. If you're trying to intimidate me, I suggest you reconsider your approach. I've dealt with actual threats from actual dangerous people, and I'm not easily impressed by posturing. They'd left, but not before Tyler had delivered a parting shot. This isn't over, Mr. Chun. Teachers who don't fit in at Lincoln High tend to find other employment pretty quickly. That afternoon, David had stayed late to research his students' backgrounds, using investigative skills honed during years of police work. What he'd discovered had explained everything and made him more concerned than ever. Tyler Morrison wasn't just wealthy. His family controlled a business empire that touched every aspect of Portland's economy. Morrison Development owned shopping centers, apartment complexes, and office buildings throughout the metro area. They held contracts with the city, donated to political campaigns, and sat on the boards of charitable organizations. Tyler's father, Richard Morrison, was the kind of man who made problems disappear with phone calls rather than violence. But the end result was the same. Jake Sullivan's family owed everything to Morrison Development. His father worked construction for Morrison Projects, his mother cleaned Morrison office buildings, and his college scholarship came from the Morrison Family Foundation. Jake wasn't just Tyler's friend. He was an indentured servant, bound by family debts and economic dependence that made rebellion impossible. Alex Hartwell came from old money, the kind of generational wealth that preferred shadows to spotlights. His family's investment firm managed portfolios for Portland's elite, including the Morrison fortune. Alex wasn't dependent on Tyler's family. But their interests were so intertwined that betrayal would mean financial ruin for both families. David had faced organized crime before, but this was different. This was organized wealth, a network of influence that operated within legal boundaries while achieving illegal results. They didn't break kneecaps. They foreclosed on mortgage. They didn't threaten families. They eliminated job opportunities. They didn't need violence when they could destroy lives with paperwork and phone calls. But David Chun had spent 12 years learning that bullies were bullies, regardless of their methods. Whether they carried guns or stock portfolios, whether they operated in back alleys or boardrooms, they all shared the same fundamental weakness. They'd never been truly challenged by someone who couldn't be bought, threatened, or intimidated into submission. The next few weeks had established a pattern. Tyler would test boundaries in class, making comments designed to provoke a reaction. Jake would position himself strategically, using his size to create an atmosphere of implied threat. Alex would watch and listen, collecting information that could be weaponized later. David had responded with professional calm, treating their provocations as teaching opportunities while documenting every incident for future reference. The breaking point had come during a lesson on the American Civil Rights Movement. David had been discussing the Montgomery bus boycott, specifically how economic pressure could be used to force social change. The boycott worked because the African American community represented a significant portion of the bus system's revenue. David explained. When they withdrew their financial support, the system couldn't survive. It's a perfect example of how economic power can be used to promote justice. Tyler had raised his hand, something he rarely did. But what about the people who lost their jobs because of the boycott? Bus drivers, mechanics, administrators? Didn't the civil rights activists hurt innocent people to make their point? It was a sophisticated question, the kind that revealed both intelligence and moral complexity. David had been preparing to give Tyler credit for thoughtful analysis when the follow-up came. I mean, it's easy to talk about justice when you're not the one paying the price. Some of us understand that change has to be gradual, that pushing too hard too fast just hurts everyone involved. The classroom had gone quiet, students recognizing the subtext. Tyler wasn't talking about the 1950s. He was talking about the present, about teachers who challenged powerful families and the consequences that followed. Mr. Morrison, David had said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd faced down armed suspects. The civil rights activists understood exactly what price they were paying. They lost jobs, faced violence, and risked their lives because they recognized that some injustices can't be tolerated regardless of the cost. They chose courage over comfort, principle over profit. Easy for you to say, Tyler had shot back, abandoning any pretense of discussing history. You don't have anything to lose. David had stepped closer to Tyler's desk, his presence filling the space with quiet authority. Mr. Morrison, I've lost more than you can imagine in the service of principle. I've buried friends, destroyed my marriage, and given up a career I loved because I refused to compromise on what I believed was right. So when I tell you that some things matter more than personal cost, I'm speaking from experience. The silence that followed had been absolute. David had revealed more about himself in those few sentences than in months of teaching, and everyone in the room had understood they were witnessing something significant. Tyler's face had cycled through shock, anger, and calculation before, settling on cold determination. That afternoon, David's car had been vandalized for the first time. 4 slashed tires and a windshield spiderwebbed by what looked like a baseball bat. The security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned during the incident, and the school's administration had expressed regret while making it clear that replacing the equipment would require board approval. David had called Detective Maria Santos, a former colleague from his SWAT days who now worked in gang enforcement. He'd given her the details without expecting immediate action, but wanting to establish a paper trail for what he suspected was coming. "You sure you want to stay in this fight?" Maria had asked. "These aren't street criminals, David. These are connected families with lawyers and political influence. They don't have to break laws to destroy you." "I know exactly what they are," David had replied. "And I know what I am. I didn't spend 12 years protecting this city just to run away from 3 spoiled teenagers." But as David had hung up the phone and looked at his damaged car, he'd wondered if Maria was right. Fighting street criminals was straightforward. They broke laws, you arrested them, and the system handled the rest. Fighting wealth and influence required different tactics, longer strategies, and a willingness to absorb damage while building a case that couldn't be dismissed or buried. The war between David Chun and the Morrison crew had begun with that vandalized car, but it had really started the moment a former SWAT commander had refused to bow to money and influence. David had faced armed terrorists and survived. Now he was about to discover if he could survive something far more dangerous. Entitled teenagers who'd never learned that actions have consequences. In room 127, surrounded by maps that chronicled the rise and fall of civilizations, David Chun prepared for a battle that would test everything he'd learned about courage, justice, and the price of standing up for what was right. He'd spent 12 years protecting people from criminals. Now he had to protect his students from bullies whose weapon of choice wasn't violence, but power, whose threats weren't spoken, but implied, and whose greatest advantage was that good people usually chose silence over the cost of resistance. David Chun had never been accused of being usual, and he was about to remind 3 young men that some people couldn't be bought, intimidated, or driven away by anything short of complete destruction. The only question was whether Lincoln High School was big enough for both a teacher who refused to compromise and students who'd never learned the meaning of limits. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the sterile efficiency of institutional bureaucracy. David Chun opened his laptop in the faculty lounge, coffee growing cold as he read the message that would force him to choose between his principles and his career. The subject line was innocuous enough. Academic review, Morrison Tyler, urgent. Response required. Dr. Harrison Blackwell, Lincoln High's academic director, had written it personally. That alone was unusual. Blackwell was the kind of administrator who delegated everything except the most politically sensitive situations. He was a thin man with expensive glasses and the nervous energy of someone who spent his days managing crises he couldn't control and donors he couldn't afford to offend. "Mr. Chun," the email began, "I've received concerning reports regarding Tyler Morrison's academic performance in your world history course. Given the Morrison family's significant contributions to our school's educational mission, I need to meet with you immediately to discuss appropriate accommodations and alternative assessment strategies. Please see me before your first period class. This matter requires urgent resolution." David read the message twice, recognizing the careful language that said everything while admitting nothing. Appropriate accommodations meant changing Tyler's grades. Alternative assessment strategies meant finding ways to pass him regardless of performance. Urgent resolution meant do what the Morrison family wants or find another job. He'd been expecting this moment since the first day Tyler had walked into his classroom. Every teacher at Lincoln High eventually faced the choice between integrity and survival. Most chose survival. David understood why. He had a mortgage, car payments, and the kind of student loans that would follow him to the grave. But he also had something most of his colleagues lacked: experience facing down threats from people far more dangerous than school board members. The walk to Blackwell's office felt like the approach to a tactical situation, that familiar sensation of entering hostile territory with incomplete intelligence and limited backup. David's footsteps echoed in the empty hallways, fluorescent lights humming their electric symphony overhead. A few early arriving students watched him pass, their expressions suggesting they already knew what was happening. News traveled fast at Lincoln High. especially news that involved the Morrison family. Dr. Blackwell's office occupied a corner of the administrative wing, its windows offering a panoramic view of the Pearl District's expensive real estate. The walls were decorated with photographs of Blackwell posing with politicians, business leaders, and donors whose checks kept Lincoln High running. A prominent display case held various awards and commendations, testaments to the school's academic excellence and community partnerships. Blackwell looked up as David entered, his expression carefully neutral, but his body language tense. 2 other people sat in the office's leather chairs: Richard Morrison, Tyler's father, and Margaret Sullivan, the school board president whose son Jake happened to be Tyler's closest friend. The setup was obvious. They weren't here for a discussion. They were here for a surrender. Richard Morrison was exactly what David expected. Silver-haired, expensively dressed, and radiating the kind of confidence that came from never hearing the word no. He was younger than his wealth suggested, probably in his early 50s, with the fitness that came from personal trainers and the tan that came from golf course memberships. His handshake was firm but calculated, designed to establish dominance, without appearing aggressive. "Mr. Chun," Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Thank you for joining us. I understand there's been some confusion about my son's academic progress." Margaret Sullivan remained seated, but her presence filled the room with political authority. She was a former city councilwoman who'd leveraged her public service into board positions with Portland's most influential institutions. Her smile was warm but predatory, the expression of someone who specialized in making problems disappear through careful negotiation and strategic pressure. "Please, sit down," Blackwell said, gesturing to the remaining chair. David remained standing, a tactical decision that kept him mobile and maintained psychological advantage. In hostage negotiations, he'd learned that controlling physical space was crucial to controlling the conversation. "I prefer to stand," David said simply. "What exactly is this about?" Morrison opened a leather portfolio and extracted several documents. "I've been reviewing Tyler's grades in your class, Mr. Chun. His current average appears to be a C-, which is obviously unacceptable for a student of his caliber." David looked at the papers, recognizing Tyler's work immediately. Test scores, essay grades, and participation marks, all accurately recorded and fairly assessed. Tyler was performing exactly at the level his effort deserved, which was mediocre at best. "Mr. Morrison, Tyler's grades reflect his performance. He turns in assignments late when he turns them in at all. His test scores suggest he's not engaging with the material. His participation in class discussions is minimal except when he's being disruptive." "Disruptive?" Margaret Sullivan spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the practiced concern of a politician addressing constituents. "Tyler has told us about your classroom environment, Mr. Chun. He says you've created a hostile atmosphere for students from certain backgrounds." David felt his jaw tighten but kept his voice level. "I treat all students equally, Mrs. Sullivan. Equal expectations, equal standards, equal consequences for their choices, but not an equal understanding of their circumstances." Morrison interjected. "Tyler carries responsibilities that other students don't have. He's expected to represent our family at community events, to understand complex business concepts, and to prepare for leadership roles in our organization. These additional pressures affect his academic performance. Mr. Morrison, every student in my class faces pressures and challenges. Some work 2 jobs to help support their families. Others are dealing with personal trauma or family dysfunction. Tyler's responsibilities don't exempt him from academic standards." Blackwell shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that the conversation was heading in a dangerous direction. "Perhaps we could discuss alternative ways to assess Tyler's understanding of the material. Special projects, oral presentations, portfolio assessments that better reflect his unique learning style." David understood the subtext immediately. They wanted him to create special assessments that Tyler couldn't fail. Busy work that would justify inflated grades without requiring actual learning. It was academic fraud dressed up in educational jargon. Dr. Blackwell, Tyler has the same opportunities as every other student. If he needs additional help, I'm available for tutoring sessions. If he has learning differences that require accommodation, we can work with the special education department to develop appropriate strategies. But I won't compromise academic integrity by lowering standards or creating special assessments. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Morrison's friendly demeanor evaporated, replaced by the cold calculation of someone accustomed to getting his way through pressure rather than persuasion. Mr. Chun, I think you're misunderstanding the situation. Lincoln High School receives significant financial support from families like mine. That support allows the school to offer programs and opportunities that wouldn't otherwise be possible. Families like mine have certain expectations about how our children are treated. Are you suggesting that grades should be based on family donations rather than academic performance? I'm suggesting that Lincoln High understands the importance of maintaining positive relationships with its benefactors. The Morrison Family Foundation has provided over $2 million in funding over the past 5 years. We're considering a substantial expansion of that support, but only if we're confident that our investment is being properly managed. David recognized the threat for what it was: submit or watch the school lose funding that supported programs, salaries, and facilities. But he also recognized something else: the assumption that he could be bought or intimidated by financial pressure. They had no idea they were dealing with someone who'd walked away from a pension and benefits because he refused to compromise his principles. Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your family's generosity to the school, but educational decisions should be based on what's best for students, not what's most convenient for donors. Margaret Sullivan leaned forward, her political instincts sensing the need for de-escalation. Mr. Chun, no one is asking you to compromise your principles. We're simply exploring ways to help Tyler succeed while maintaining academic standards. Surely there's room for creative solutions that benefit everyone. Mrs. Sullivan, Tyler can succeed the same way every other student succeeds: by attending class, completing assignments, and engaging with the material. If he chooses not to do those things, his grades will reflect that choice. Blackwell made one final attempt at mediation. David, perhaps we could arrange a meeting with Tyler to discuss his academic goals and develop a personalized learning plan. Sometimes students need additional motivation or different approaches to reach their potential. I'm willing to meet with Tyler anytime he wants to discuss his academic progress. But any learning plan will include the same requirements as every other student: attendance, participation, and completion of assignments to my standards. Morrison stood up, his movement sharp and decisive. Mr. Chun, I'm going to be very clear about something. Lincoln High School has had 3 history teachers in the past 4 years. Each of them left for different reasons: budget cuts, family relocations, better opportunities elsewhere. But what they all shared was a failure to understand how things work here. The threat was obvious but carefully crafted to avoid anything legally actionable. David had heard similar implications from gang leaders and drug dealers, but they'd usually been more direct about their intentions. Morrison's approach was more sophisticated, but no less menacing. Mr. Morrison, are you threatening my employment because I won't inflate your son's grades? I'm explaining reality. Teachers who don't fit into Lincoln High's culture tend to find other opportunities. Sometimes those opportunities are in different districts, different states, sometimes different careers entirely. I'd hate to see you make the same mistakes as your predecessors. David stepped closer to Morrison, his posture shifting subtly to project the authority he'd carried as a SWAT commander. Mr. Morrison, I've dealt with actual threats from actual dangerous people. I've been shot at by criminals, threatened by gang members, and intimidated by suspects who had nothing left to Lose. Your son gets the grades he earns, regardless of how much money your family donates to this school. The silence that followed was electric. Morrison's face flushed red, unused to being challenged so directly. Sullivan looked shocked that a teacher would speak to a major donor with such bluntness. Blackwell appeared ready to faint. "You're making a serious mistake, Mr. Chun," Morrison said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "A very serious mistake. The only mistake would be teaching your son that money can buy success without effort. That's not education, Mr. Morrison. That's corruption." Morrison gathered his papers and stood to leave, his movements sharp with barely contained fury. "Dr. Blackwell, I expect this situation to be resolved quickly and appropriately. Mrs. Sullivan, I think the board needs to review Lincoln High's hiring and evaluation procedures. We can't afford to have teachers who don't understand our school's mission." After they left, Blackwell slumped in his chair like a man who just watched his career go up in flames. "David, do you have any idea what you've just done? The Morrison family can destroy this school's budget with a single phone call. They can have you fired, blacklisted, and unemployable in education within a week. Dr. Blackwell, I took an oath when I became a teacher to serve my students' best interests. Tyler Morrison is my student, and his best interest is learning that actions have consequences, that success requires effort, and that grades reflect performance, not family connections. Those are noble sentiments, David, but nobility doesn't pay salaries or fund programs. The reality is that schools like Lincoln High depend on donor support to survive. We can't afford to alienate families like the Morrisons." David picked up his bag and headed for the door. "Dr. Blackwell, I understand the financial pressures you're facing. But the moment we start selling grades to the highest bidder, we stop being educators and become something else entirely. I won't be part of that transformation." As David walked back to his classroom, he noticed groups of students watching him with expressions ranging from admiration to concern. Word of the confrontation had already spread, as it always did at Lincoln High. By lunch, every student would know that Mr. Chun had refused to change Tyler Morrison's grades despite pressure from the family that funded half the school's programs. In his classroom, David found an envelope on his desk marked "Personal and Confidential." Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message typed in block letters. "Teachers who make enemies don't last long at Lincoln High. Ask Mr. Rodriguez about his house fire. Ask Mrs. Park about her daughter's college applications. Smart people learn from other people's mistakes." David photographed the letter and forwarded it to Detective Maria Santos along with a detailed summary of the morning's meeting. Then he locked the letter in his desk drawer and began preparing for his first period class. If the Morrison family thought they could intimidate him with vague threats and anonymous notes, they had seriously underestimated their opponent, Tyler. Morrison walked into the first period 15 minutes late, as had become his habit. But today was different. Today he carried himself with the swagger of someone who'd been assured that his problems were about to disappear. He took his seat in the back corner and pulled out his phone, no longer bothering to hide his disregard for classroom rules. "Mr. Morrison," David said, not pausing in his lesson about the French Revolution, "please put your phone away and join our discussion about the causes of social revolution." Tyler looked up with a smirk that suggested he knew something David didn't. "Actually, Mr. Chun, I think I'll just observe today. I'm sure you understand my position." The other students exchanged glances, sensing the tension that filled the room like electricity before a storm. David continued his lesson, but everyone understood that something fundamental had changed. The battle lines had been drawn, and Tyler Morrison was confident he held the winning hand. But David Chun had spent 12 years learning that overconfidence was often the first step toward defeat. As he taught his class about how the French aristocracy had underestimated the revolution that would destroy them, He wondered if Tyler Morrison understood that history had a way of repeating itself, especially for those who forgot that power. Without accountability was just tyranny waiting to collapse. The real war was just beginning, and neither side fully understood what the other was capable of. But by the end of the day, both David and Tyler would learn that some battles couldn't be won with money or influence, and some people couldn't be broken by threats or intimidation. The question was whether Lincoln High School could survive the collision between an unstoppable force and an immovable object. The first casualty of war was always truth, and David Chun was about to discover just how creative wealthy families could be when it came to rewriting reality. The attack began at 6:47 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, delivered through the digital networks that connected every aspect of modern life. David's phone buzzed with the first notification while he was brewing coffee in his small apartment kitchen, the morning news playing softly in the background. The notification was from the Lincoln High School parent portal. Urgent. Teacher under investigation for inappropriate conduct. David's coffee mug froze halfway to his lips as he read the message. According to the automated system, multiple parents had filed formal complaints alleging unprofessional behavior, political bias, and creating a hostile learning environment. The investigation would begin immediately, and David was required to report to the district office before school started. His phone rang before he could fully process the implications. Dr. Janet Rivera, Lincoln High's district superintendent, sounded tired and stressed. "David, I need you to come to my office immediately. We have a situation that requires immediate attention." "Dr. Rivera, what exactly am I being accused of?" "I can't discuss details over the phone. Just get here as soon as possible, and David... You might want to bring union representation." The drive to the district office felt like entering enemy territory. David's tactical training automatically cataloged potential threats and escape routes, a habit that had never fully disappeared, despite years of civilian life. The morning traffic moved with its usual Portland sluggishness, giving him time to consider the implications of what was happening. Fabricated complaints were a classic intimidation tactic, one he'd seen organized crime families use against honest cops and prosecutors. Create enough smoke to suggest fire, force the target to defend against vague accusations, and let bureaucratic processes do the actual damage. It was elegant, legal, and devastatingly effective against people who couldn't afford extended legal battles. The district office occupied a modern building in downtown Portland, its glass and steel architecture designed to project efficiency and transparency. David had been there only once before, during his initial hiring interview, when the future had seemed full of possibility rather than political landmines. Now the building felt like a courthouse where the verdict had already been decided. Dr. Rivera's office was larger than Principal Martinez's but felt smaller due to the tension that filled every corner. Rivera was a career educator who'd worked her way up through the ranks, earning respect through competence rather than connections. She was also a realist who understood that school districts survived through careful navigation of political pressures. Rather than moral grandstanding, "David, sit down. We need to talk about some serious allegations that have been brought to my attention." Rivera opened a thick folder and began reading from a list that seemed designed to destroy his career through 1,000 small cuts. According to the complaints, David had shown political bias in his teaching, made inappropriate comments about wealthy families, created a hostile environment for certain students, and violated district policies regarding fair and equitable treatment. "Dr. Rivera, these allegations are completely false. My teaching methods are documented, my lesson plans are approved, and my interactions with students are professional and appropriate." "I believe you, David, but belief isn't enough when parents start filing formal complaints and threatening legal action." "The Morrison family has submitted a particularly detailed allegation claiming you've targeted Tyler for harassment based on his family's economic status. David felt anger building but kept his voice level. "Dr. Rivera, Tyler Morrison is failing my class because he doesn't attend regularly, doesn't complete assignments, and disrupts classroom discussions. His grades reflect his performance, nothing more. I understand that, but the Morrison family has documentation suggesting otherwise. They have recordings of classroom discussions where you allegedly made disparaging comments about wealthy families. They have testimony from other students claiming you've created an atmosphere of economic prejudice." David's mind raced through recent classroom discussions, trying to identify which conversations could have been twisted to support false allegations. His lessons on economic inequality, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, discussions of corporate responsibility. Any of them could be taken out of context and weaponized by someone with sufficient motivation and resources. "Dr. Rivera, I've taught about economic systems and their historical impacts. That's part of the approved curriculum. If teaching about the French Revolution is now considered anti-wealth bias, then we need to rewrite every history textbook in Cofon Iame Emperla. America." Rivera looked genuinely pained, caught between supporting a teacher she respected and managing political pressures that could destroy her own career. "David, it's not what you taught, it's how it was perceived. The Morrison family claims you used their son as a negative example, that you singled him out for public humiliation based on his family's success. Dr. Rivera, that's not what happened. Tyler Morrison disrupts class, refuses to follow basic rules, and shows disrespect for other students and the learning process. When I address his behavior, I'm doing my job as an educator. But according to these complaints, your response to his behavior was disproportionate and motivated by personal bias against his family's wealth." David realized he was experiencing something he'd never faced during his police career, fighting an enemy who used bureaucracy as a weapon. Criminals shot at you, threatened you, or tried to run away. But wealthy families destroyed you with paperwork, formal procedures, and legal processes that turned your own system against you. "Dr. Rivera, what do you need from me to resolve this?" Rivera pulled out another document, this one bearing the district's official letterhead. "For now, you're being placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. You'll receive full pay and benefits, but you cannot enter Lincoln High School or contact any students, parents, or staff members involved in the investigation." How long will this investigation take? These things can drag on for months, especially when lawyers get involved. The Morrison family has retained Blackstone and Associates, one of Portland's most prestigious law firms. They're demanding a thorough review of your employment history, your teaching methods, and your interactions with all students, not just Tyler. David accepted the paperwork that officially suspended him from the job he'd grown to love. As he walked back to his car, he noticed a familiar vehicle in the parking lot, Richard Morrison's black Mercedes, its driver reading a newspaper while waiting for his passenger. The message was clear: they were monitoring his movements, documenting his responses, and making sure he understood the extent of their reach. But if the Morrison family thought administrative leave would silence David Chen, they had seriously miscalculated. During his SWAT career, he'd learned that sometimes the best defense was a strategic offense, and he had resources they didn't know about. Detective Maria Santos met him for lunch at a small cafe in southeast Portland, far from the Pearl District's expensive restaurants where Lincoln High's power brokers conducted their business. Maria was one of the few people who knew David's full story, including the reasons he'd left law enforcement and the skills he'd retained despite his career change. "So they're trying to destroy your reputation instead of just firing you," Maria said, reviewing the documents David had brought. "Smart move. Much harder to fight false allegations than a simple termination. What are my options, Maria? Officially? Hire a lawyer, fight the charges, and hope the investigation clears you before your savings run out. Unofficially? Use what you learned during 12 years of police work to build a case against them. You're suggesting I investigate the Morrison family? I'm suggesting that people who are comfortable fabricating charges against teachers have probably done similar things to other people. If you can find a pattern of behavior, you might be able to turn this around. That afternoon, David began what he privately called Operation Clean Slate, a systematic investigation into the Morrison family's business practices and their history of dealing with people who opposed them. He started with public records, using research skills honed during years of building criminal cases. The Morrison family's influence extended far beyond real estate development. They sat on the boards of Portland's major charitable organizations, funded political campaigns for city council members and county commissioners, and held contracts for municipal construction projects worth millions of dollars. Their business empire was built on relationships rather than buildings, networks of obligation and reciprocity that made opposition both difficult and dangerous. But David also found something interesting in the public records, a pattern of lawsuits and legal settlements that suggested the Morrison family had a history of using legal pressure to silence critics. 3 former employees had filed wrongful termination suits in the past 5 years, all settled out of court with confidentiality agreements. 2 environmental activists had been sued for defamation after questioning Morrison Development's building practices, their lawsuits abandoned after the activists' employers received threatening letters from Morrison's legal team. Most interesting was the case of Marcus Rodriguez, the former Lincoln High history teacher who'd been forced to resign 3 years earlier. According to school board minutes that David found online, Rodriguez had been accused of creating division in the classroom and failing to maintain appropriate professional boundaries with students. The accusations were vague but effective. Rodriguez had resigned rather than fight charges that would have destroyed his career regardless of their truth. David found Rodriguez working at a small private school in Salem, Oregon, teaching classes half the size of those at Lincoln High, for a fraction of the salary. When they met for coffee, Rodriguez looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in 3, his enthusiasm for teaching replaced by the cautious wariness of someone who'd learned that doing the right thing could destroy your life. Tyler Morrison was in my American government class, Rodriguez explained, his voice barely above a whisper despite the coffee shop's privacy. He was failing because he never attended and never participated. When I refused to change his grade, his father launched a campaign to destroy my reputation. What kind of campaign? It started with complaints about my teaching methods, then escalated to allegations that I was showing favoritism to certain students while discriminating against others. Parents who'd never spoken to me before suddenly remembered concerning conversations that had never happened. Students who'd been friendly started avoiding me like I was radioactive. Did you fight the charges? Rodriguez laughed bitterly. With what? Teachers don't make enough money to hire lawyers who can go toe-to-toe with firms like Blackstone and Associates. I had a choice: resign quietly with a neutral reference, or fight charges that would follow me forever regardless of the outcome. What happened to the other teachers who crossed the Morrison family? Sandra Park lasted 6 months after giving Tyler a D in advanced placement literature. Suddenly, her teaching credentials were being questioned by the state education department. Anonymous complaints were filed against her with Child Protective Services, and her daughter's college applications were mysteriously rejected by schools that had initially shown interest. David felt his anger building as Rodriguez continued. James Mitchell, the economics teacher, made the mistake of using Morrison Development as a case study in corporate responsibility. His car was vandalized repeatedly. His home address was posted on social media with allegations that he was a danger to children. And his wife received threatening phone calls at work. Where are they now? Park moved back to California to care for her aging mother. Mitchell left education entirely and now works in insurance. Both of them were excellent teachers who loved their jobs, But the Morrison family made their lives unbearable until they had no choice but to leave. As David drove back to Portland, he understood that he wasn't just fighting for his job or his reputation. He was fighting against a system that allowed wealth to corrupt education, that permitted families like the Morrisons to destroy teachers who refused to compromise their principles. But unlike his predecessors, David Chun had advantages they'd lacked: investigative skills, law enforcement contacts, and the kind of tactical experience that taught you how to fight enemies who seemed untouchable. That evening, his apartment felt like a command center as David spread documents across his dining table and began mapping the Morrison family's network of influence. Financial records, political donations, business partnerships, legal settlements. Together they painted a picture of a family that had weaponized wealth to control everyone who might threaten their interests. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Smart teachers learn when to quit. Stupid teachers learn the hard way. Choose wisely. David photographed the message and added it to the file he was building. Then he opened his laptop and began typing a detailed response to the allegations against him, using the same methodical approach he'd once applied to tactical operations. The Morrison family had declared war on his career and reputation, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed he would respond like a typical teacher rather than a former SWAT commander. By morning, David Chun would have a strategy that turned their strengths into weaknesses and their confidence into vulnerability. The battle for his career was just beginning, but he was no longer fighting it alone. Somewhere in Portland, other victims of Morrison family intimidation were about to discover that someone was finally willing to stand up to the bullies who'd made their lives miserable. The investigation into David's alleged misconduct would continue, but now there would be a parallel investigation into the investigators. The Morrison family had created a powerful enemy, and they were about to learn that some people became more dangerous when cornered rather than more compliant. In room 127 at Lincoln High School, a substitute teacher was struggling to maintain order among students who sensed weakness and opportunity. Tyler Morrison sat in the back corner, his phone out openly, making no pretense of paying attention to the lesson. His smirk suggested he believed he'd won a decisive victory, that David Chun was finished and would never return. But victory celebrations were premature when your opponent was someone who'd spent 12 years learning that the most dangerous enemies were often the ones who appeared defeated. David Chun was far from finished, and Tyler Morrison was about to discover that attacking a former SWAT commander was like poking a sleeping tiger with a very short stick. The breakthrough came at 2:17 a.m. on a Thursday night, delivered through the digital forensic skills David Chun had developed during 8 years of investigating cybercrime and financial fraud. While Portland slept, David sat in his apartment surrounded by multiple computer screens, following money trails and communication patterns that painted a picture far darker than simple grade manipulation. The Morrison family wasn't just intimidating teachers, they were running a systematic corruption operation that reached into every level of Portland's educational and political infrastructure. What David had discovered in the past week would have been enough to launch federal investigations if he'd still been wearing a badge. Now, as a suspended teacher fighting for his career, he had to be more careful about how he used the information. The first major revelation had come through social media forensics. Alex Hartwell, Tyler's strategic partner, had been documenting their operations with the casual arrogance of someone who believed wealth made them untouchable. Instagram posts showed expensive dinners with school board members, snapshots from private parties at Morrison family properties, and group photos that included the children of Portland's political elite. But the real treasure trove was in the metadata and geotagging that Alex had carelessly left enabled. David could track the Hartwell family's movements through the city, correlating their locations with meetings that weren't supposed to exist and conversations that would horrify the public if they became known. One particular photo had stopped David cold. Taken 3 months earlier at the Morrison family's Lake Oswego estate, it showed Tyler, Jake, and Alex posing with several adults including Margaret Sullivan, Dr. Harrison Blackwell, and a woman David recognized as Patricia Chin, no relation. Despite the shared surname, who served as Lincoln High's head of student services. The caption read, "Planning Committee for Lincoln's Future Excellence," with laughing emojis that suggested the planning involved more than educational improvement. Cross-referencing the date with school records, David discovered that the photo was taken the same night the district had voted to implement new flexible assessment protocols that gave teachers discretionary authority to modify grading standards for students facing unique challenges. The policy had been presented as supporting diverse learning styles, but David now understood its real purpose, providing legal cover for grade manipulation. The second breakthrough came through financial records that Detective Maria Santos had helped him access through official channels. The Morrison Family Foundation's tax filings revealed a pattern of strategic donations that looked suspiciously like bribes disguised as charitable giving. Blackstone and Associates, the law firm representing the Morrison family in their case against David, had received $200,000 in legal consultation fees from the foundation in the month before David's investigation began. Dr. Rivera's husband worked for a marketing firm that had received a $150,000 contract from Morrison Development just days after the administrative leave was imposed. Even Principal Martinez's daughter had received a full scholarship to a private college, scholarship funded by Morrison Family Trusts. But the most damning evidence came from Marcus Rodriguez, the former Lincoln High teacher who'd been destroyed 3 years earlier. During their second meeting, Rodriguez had provided David with something he'd kept secret for 3 years, recordings of conversations he'd made during his final weeks at Lincoln High. "I started recording everything after the first false accusation," Rodriguez explained, sliding a flash drive across the coffee shop table. "I thought if I could prove they were lying, I could save my career. But by the time I had enough evidence, the damage was already done." The recordings were devastating. Phone calls between Richard Morrison and Dr. Blackwell, discussing problematic teachers and necessary adjustments to personnel. Conversations between Margaret Sullivan and other school board members about managing difficult situations and protecting our institutional partnerships. Most importantly, a recording of Tyler Morrison bragging to friends about his family's ability to destroy anyone who gets in our way. But the recording that would change everything was Tyler's voice describing what they'd done to Sandra Park, the former AP literature teacher. "We made her life hell," Tyler laughed. Dad had his people call her daughter's college admissions offices, telling them she was under investigation for academic fraud. Her kid went from full scholarships to rejection letters in 2 weeks. Park resigned rather than watch her daughter's future get destroyed. David realized he wasn't just fighting educational corruption. He was fighting organized crime that happened to wear expensive suits and operate through legal channels. The Morrison family had weaponized the system itself, turning institutions meant to serve the public into tools for personal vendetta and social control. The third breakthrough was the most personal and the most dangerous. While researching property records, David discovered that his own apartment lease was managed by a subsidiary company connected to Morrison Development. His landlord, his insurance company, even his bank all had financial relationships with Morrison family businesses. They'd been positioning themselves to destroy his life from every possible angle, but they'd also made a mistake that would prove fatal to their plans. In their confidence and arrogance, they documented everything. Alex Hartwell's social media posts, Richard Morrison's email communications with law firms and school officials, Jake Sullivan's text messages coordinating intimidation campaigns together. They created a digital paper trail that law enforcement would find irresistible. David spent Friday morning preparing what he privately called the Revelation Package, a comprehensive dossier that exposed the Morrison family's corruption network and provided irrefutable evidence of their systematic abuse of power. The package included financial records, recorded conversations, digital evidence, and testimony from multiple victims, spanning 5 years of criminal activity. But revealing the evidence required careful strategy. The Morrison family's influence extended into law enforcement and local government, making it dangerous to trust traditional channels. David needed allies who couldn't be bought or intimidated, people with their own power bases and reasons to see justice done. His first stop was the office of Jennifer Walsh, an investigative reporter for the Oregonian, who'd built her career exposing corruption in Portland's business and political communities. Walsh was known for her thorough research and fearless reporting, qualities that had made her enemies among the city's elite, but allies among people who valued truth over convenience. "Mr. Chun," Walsh said, reviewing the documents David had brought, "this is explosive stuff. If even half of this is accurate, we're looking at systemic corruption that reaches from high school classrooms to City Hall." "It's all accurate, Ms. Walsh. I have recordings, financial records, and multiple witnesses who can verify every allegation. The Morrison family has been running Portland's educational system like their personal fiefdom, destroying anyone who threatens their control." Walsh studied the recorded conversations, her expression growing darker with each revelation. "This, Tyler Morrison recording about Sandra Park, if this is authentic. We're talking about criminal conspiracy, witness intimidation, and civil rights violations. It's authentic. And it's just the beginning. The Morrison family has been systematically targeting teachers, administrators, and even students who don't conform to their vision of how Lincoln High should operate. Mr. Chun, if I publish this story, you understand that it will trigger a war? The Morrison family won't just destroy your teaching career, they'll try to destroy your entire life." David met her gaze with the steady confidence of someone who'd faced much worse than wealthy bullies. "Ms. Walsh, they've already declared war on my life. I'm just finally choosing to fight back." That afternoon, David received an unexpected phone call from Lisa Park, Sandra Park's daughter, the same daughter whose college dreams had been shattered by Morrison family interference. Lisa was now a senior at Portland State University, studying journalism with a focus on investigative reporting. "Mr. Chun, I heard through the academic community that you're fighting the Morrison family. I want to help." They met at a small cafe near the PSU campus, where Lisa shared her own story of Morrison family vindictiveness. Her mother had been an excellent teacher, passionate about literature, and dedicated to her students' success. But when Sandra Park had refused to change Tyler Morrison's grade from a D to a B, the family had launched a campaign of destruction that left both mother and daughter emotionally and financially devastated. "They didn't just destroy my college prospects," Lisa explained, her voice tight with controlled anger. "They made sure every scholarship I'd been offered was withdrawn. They contacted universities with false allegations about my academic integrity, my mother's professional conduct, even our family's financial situation. We went from financial stability to crisis in less than 6 months. Lisa, I'm sorry about what happened to you and your mother. No family should have to endure that kind of systematic harassment. Mr. Chun, what makes me angriest isn't what they did to us, it's that they've done it to so many others and gotten away with it. How many teachers have they destroyed? How many students have they silenced? How many families have they forced into compliance through fear?" Lisa pulled out a laptop and showed David something that made his tactical mind immediately understand the true scope of the Morrison family's influence. She'd been investigating them for 3 years, building a database of victims, documenting patterns of abuse, and collecting evidence for what she hoped would eventually become a comprehensive expose. "I have testimony from 12 families who've been targeted by Morrison retaliation. Teachers who were fired, students who were expelled. Parents who lost jobs or business contracts after challenging Morrison family decisions. They operate like an organized crime family, but with legal weapons instead of illegal ones. David studied Lisa's research, recognizing the thoroughness and attention to detail that characterized excellent investigative work. Lisa, this is impressive. Work. Have you shared this with law enforcement? I tried. But most local agencies have financial relationships with Morrison businesses. Detective Santos in gang enforcement was the only one who took me seriously, but she said she needed more direct evidence of criminal activity rather than just civil rights violations. The mention of Maria Santos made David smile. His former colleague had been feeding him information while helping Lisa Park build her case. The three of them had been working toward the same goal from different angles, and now it was time to coordinate their efforts. That evening, David's apartment became a war room as Lisa, and Detective Santos reviewed the complete scope of Morrison family corruption. Financial charts covered one wall, victim testimonies filled another, and digital evidence was organized across multiple computer screens. What they'd assembled was more than enough to trigger federal investigations and destroy the Morrison family's carefully constructed empire. The question now, Santos said, is how to present this information in a way that can't be suppressed or buried. The Morrison family has too much influence over local institutions to trust normal channels. What about federal channels? David asked. This crosses state lines, involves wire fraud, and includes civil rights violations that fall under federal jurisdiction. That's exactly what I was thinking. I have contacts with the FBI's white-collar crime unit who would love to get their hands on this kind of systematic corruption case. Lisa looked up from her laptop where she'd been preparing the final version of her investigative report. I also have contacts at national news organizations who would be interested in this story. The Morrison family's influence is local, but the pattern of using wealth to corrupt educational institutions is national. David felt the familiar calm that preceded tactical operations. For weeks he'd been reacting to Morrison family attacks, fighting their chosen battles on their preferred terrain. But now, armed with irrefutable evidence and powerful allies, he was ready to go on the offensive. Here's what we're going to do, David said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to planning complex operations. We coordinate simultaneous releases through multiple channels, federal law enforcement, national media, and state education officials. We make it impossible for the Morrison family to suppress the story or retaliate against individual victims. Santos nodded approvingly. Overwhelming force, applied simultaneously across multiple fronts. Classic tactical doctrine. But first, David continued, we need to make sure Tyler Morrison and his crew can't destroy evidence or intimidate additional witnesses. That means we need them focused on something else while we prepare the final assault. What kind of distraction? Lisa asked. David smiled, the expression of someone who'd spent years outmaneuvering dangerous criminals. We're going to give them exactly what they think they want, a chance to destroy me publicly and completely. They'll be so focused on their victory celebration that they won't notice us cutting off their escape routes. The plan that David outlined was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential impact. The Morrison family would get their confrontation, but on David's terms and with consequences they couldn't imagine. Tyler Morrison thought he'd won by getting David suspended from teaching. He was about to discover that attacking a former SWAT commander was like cutting the head off a hydra instead of dying. The enemy became something far more dangerous. As the three conspirators finalized their strategy, David felt the satisfaction that came from turning the tables on bullies who'd assumed their wealth made them untouchable. The Morrison family had declared war on honest educators and innocent families. Now they were about to learn what real war looked like when their opponent was someone who understood that sometimes the most peaceful thing you could do was ensure that predators faced consequences for their actions. The final battle was approaching, and David Chun was ready to remind 3 spoiled teenagers that some people couldn't be bought, intimidated, or destroyed by anything short of complete victory. The question was whether Tyler Morrison would recognize his defeat before it was too late to prevent the total destruction of everything his family had built through corruption and fear. The gasoline fumes hit David's nostrils like a chemical alarm, sharp and acrid in the cold October air. 20 feet away, Tyler Morrison held a Zippo lighter with the casual confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. The parking lot of Lincoln High School stretched around them like an arena, empty except for the 4 figures caught in a deadly game that none of them fully understood. David Chun stood perfectly still, his body relaxed but ready, every sense cataloging potential threats and escape routes. Behind him, his rental car dripped accelerant onto the asphalt, creating a pool of destruction waiting for ignition. To his left, Jake Sullivan gripped a baseball bat with white knuckles, his massive frame coiled for violence. To his right, Alex Hartwell held his phone steady, recording what he believed would be David's final humiliation. But Tyler Morrison, the architect of this confrontation, had made a fatal error in calculation. He'd assumed David Chun would respond like every other teacher he'd terrorized, with fear, submission, and desperate bargaining. He had no idea he was facing a man who'd spent 12 years preparing for moments exactly like this one. "You know what I love most about this?" Tyler said, his voice carrying across the empty parking lot. "Tomorrow morning, everyone will read about the unstable teacher who finally snapped. The dangerous ex-cop who couldn't handle civilian life and threatened innocent students with violence." David's eyes remained fixed on Tyler's hands, tracking the lighter's movement with the precision of someone trained to anticipate weapon deployment. "Tyler, you have one chance to walk away from this. I suggest you take it." "Walk away?" Tyler laughed, the sound echoing off the school building's brick walls. "From you? You're finished, Chun. Destroyed. My father's lawyers have already prepared the narrative." David Chun, the violent ex-SWAT officer who brought his dangerous mentality into a peaceful school environment. Alex stepped closer, his phone camera capturing every word. This is perfect footage. The threatening teacher confronting innocent students. The viral video that will end your career forever. But Jake Sullivan seemed less confident than his companions. Something in David's posture, his absolute stillness, triggered instincts that came from years of recognizing real danger. "Tyler, maybe we should just leave. We made our point." "Leave?" Tyler's voice rose with the petulant anger of someone accustomed to getting his way. "He embarrassed my family. He refused our money. He actually thought he could stand up to us and win. This ends tonight." David calculated angles and distances with tactical precision. Tyler was 15 feet away, close enough for the lighter to ignite gasoline vapors, but far enough to give David reaction time. Jake stood 8 feet to the left, his baseball bat raised, but his body language uncertain. Alex remained focused on his phone, treating this like theater rather than recognizing the very real danger they'd created. "Tyler," David said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life or death situations, "you're about to cross a line that will destroy your life and your family's reputation forever. Attempted arson is a federal crime. Threatening a teacher with violence is assault. Recording it for social media makes it premeditated." "Threatening?" Tyler stepped closer, the lighter dancing in his hand. "You're the one who's been threatening my family. You're the one who refused to be reasonable. You're the one who brought this on yourself." David's training kicked in automatically. Rule 1 in hostage situations: keep talking, de-escalate if possible, but be ready for violence. Rule 2: protect innocent life above all else. Rule 3: when violence becomes inevitable, end it quickly and decisively. "Tyler, think about what you're doing. Your father spent millions building your family's reputation. Are you really willing to destroy all of that for a high school grade? This isn't about grades anymore, Tyler snarled. This is about respect. This is about understanding that some people can't be challenged, can't be embarrassed, can't be made to look weak in front of others. Alex lowered his phone slightly, finally recognizing that the situation was spiraling beyond their control. Tyler, maybe Jake's right. We made our point. Chun knows he's finished. Let's just go. But Tyler Morrison had inherited more than wealth. He'd inherited the kind of narcissistic rage that turned disappointment into violence. No, he humiliated me in front of the whole school. He made me look weak. He's going to learn what happens when you mess with my family. The lighter moved closer to the gasoline-soaked car. David measured the distance, calculated the timing, and prepared for what tactical manuals called dynamic entry, the explosive violence necessary to neutralize imminent threats. That's when Tyler made his final mistake. Say goodbye to your car, Chun. Say goodbye to your career. Say goodbye to any hope of teaching anywhere ever again. The lighter flicked open, flame dancing against the darkness. David Chun stopped being a suspended teacher and became what he'd always been underneath the civilian clothes, a tactical operator trained to protect innocent life and neutralize threats with overwhelming force. David moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd practiced these movements 10,000 times. As Tyler's hand descended toward the gasoline, David exploded forward, covering 15 feet in less than 2 seconds. His shoulder hit Tyler's chest with the impact of a guided missile, sending the teenager flying backward while the lighter spun harmlessly through the air. Jake Sullivan raised his baseball bat, but David was already inside his swing arc. A precise strike to Jake's wrist sent the bat clattering across the pavement, while a follow-up movement put the massive football player face down on the asphalt with his arm twisted behind his back in a submission hold that made resistance impossible. Alex. Hartwell had enough time to scream, "Oh shit," before David's free hand relieved him of his phone and sent him sprawling across the parking lot. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 10 seconds, leaving 3 would-be arsonists neutralized and gasping while David maintained control with the calm efficiency of someone who'd done this professionally for over a decade. "Nobody move," David commanded, his voice carrying the authority that had once coordinated tactical operations. "Tyler, if you reach for anything other than your wallet and car keys, this situation becomes much worse for you." Tyler Morrison lay on his back, staring up at a man who'd just demolished every assumption he'd made about power, influence, and consequences. For the first time in his 17 years, Tyler Morrison was experiencing fear, not the abstract worry of minor consequences, but the primal terror of realizing he'd seriously underestimated a dangerous opponent. "You can't touch us," Tyler gasped, struggling to breathe after David's tackle. "My father owns half this city. You're finished. You're dead." David maintained his control holds while pulling out his phone with practiced one-handed efficiency. "Tyler, your father doesn't own the FBI. He doesn't own federal prosecutors. And he certainly doesn't own the national media outlets that are about to receive very interesting information about your family's activities." Alex Hartwell tried to crawl toward his dropped phone, but David's foot settled on his wrist with enough pressure to make movement inadvisable. "Alex, I wouldn't recommend that. Your phone contains evidence of criminal conspiracy, and I think federal investigators will find it very interesting." "Evidence?" Jake wheezed from his position on the asphalt. "Evidence of what?" David smiled, the expression of someone who'd been planning this moment for weeks. "Evidence of systematic corruption, bribery, witness intimidation, and civil rights violations spanning 5 years. Did you really think I spent my suspension sitting around, feeling sorry for myself?" Tyler's face went white as the implications hit him. "You can't prove anything. We were careful. We used lawyers. Everything we did was legal." "Tyler, threatening to burn a teacher's car isn't legal." Conspiring to intimidate witnesses isn't legal. And thanks to Alex's compulsive need to document everything, you've provided video evidence of criminal conspiracy. David pulled out his own phone, showing them a screen that made all three teenagers' blood run cold. This is a live stream to Detective Maria Santos, FBI Agent Jennifer Walsh, and 3 national news organizations. Everything you've said and done tonight has been recorded and transmitted in real time. The color drained from Alex's face as he realized they'd been outmaneuvered completely. You set us up. You planned this whole thing. I gave you multiple opportunities to walk away. You chose escalation over wisdom. You chose arson over acceptance. You chose to threaten someone who spent 12 years learning how to neutralize threats like you. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as emergency vehicles approached Lincoln High School. David had triggered multiple response protocols. Police, fire department, and federal agents who'd been positioned strategically around the school grounds. This isn't over, Tyler snarled, his voice cracking with panic and rage. My father will destroy you. He'll destroy your family. He'll destroy everyone you've ever cared about. David's expression hardened, revealing glimpses of the tactical commander who'd faced armed terrorists without flinching. Tyler, your father's empire is about to collapse. While you've been playing games, I've been building a federal case that will put your entire family in prison for decades. The first police cars arrived with lights flashing and sirens blaring. Detective Maria Santos emerged from the lead vehicle, followed by FBI agents who'd been coordinating with local law enforcement for weeks. Behind them came fire department personnel, prepared to deal with the gasoline-soaked vehicle that represented attempted arson. David, Santos called out, her voice carrying relief and professional satisfaction. Are you all right? I'm fine, Maria, but these 3 gentlemen are about to have a very bad evening. As federal agents moved to arrest Tyler, Jake, and Alex, David finally released his control holds and stepped back. The teenagers who'd terrorized Lincoln High School for years suddenly looked very small and very young as they faced the reality of federal charges and national media attention. Tyler Morrison made one final attempt to assert his family's influence. You don't understand who you're arresting. My father is Richard Morrison. He owns buildings all over Portland. He sits on city boards. He funds political campaigns. FBI Agent Jennifer Walsh, the same investigative reporter who'd helped David build his case, stepped forward with a smile that mixed professional satisfaction with personal vindication. Mr. Morrison, your father is currently being arrested at his home on charges of racketeering, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. Your family's influence just became your family's liability. As the teenagers were read their rights and loaded into federal vehicles, David watched the end of a reign of terror that had lasted too long and destroyed too many innocent lives. The Morrison family's empire of intimidation was crumbling, their network of corruption exposed, and their assumption of untouchability revealed as nothing more than expensive delusion. But David Chun felt no satisfaction in their defeat, only relief that other teachers and students would never again face the kind of systematic harassment that had driven good people from careers they loved. Justice wasn't about revenge, it was about ensuring that predators faced consequences and victims found protection. As the last police car pulled away from Lincoln High School, David stood alone in the parking lot where his war with the Morrison family had finally ended. His rental car would need professional cleaning to remove the gasoline, but that seemed like a minor inconvenience compared to the alternative timeline where Tyler Morrison had successfully destroyed another teacher's career and intimidated another generation of students into silence. Tomorrow, the story will dominate national news. The Morrison family's corruption network would face federal prosecution. Tyler, Jake, and Alex would discover that wealth couldn't buy escape from the consequences of attempted arson and criminal conspiracy. But tonight, David Chun was simply a teacher who'd protected his profession, his principles, and his community from bullies who'd forgotten that, in America, no one, regardless of wealth or influence, was truly above the law. The war was over. Justice had won. And somewhere in Portland, teachers could go back to educating students without fear that speaking the truth would destroy their lives. 6 months after the parking lot confrontation that ended the Morrison family's reign of terror, David Chun stood before a packed auditorium at the Department of Education's National Conference on Educational Integrity. The audience of teachers, administrators, and policymakers had come to hear from the man who'd become a symbol of resistance against corruption in American schools. But David wasn't thinking about his national recognition as he looked out at the faces before him. He was thinking about the email he'd received that morning from Sarah Martinez, a 17-year-old student at Lincoln High School who'd written to thank him for making it possible for her to speak up about academic dishonesty without fear of retaliation. "Ladies and gentlemen," David began, his voice carrying the authority earned through months of testimony before congressional committees and federal grand juries. "I want to tell you about 3 students who thought wealth made them untouchable, and how their downfall transformed an entire educational system." The Morrison case had become a watershed moment in American education, exposing corruption networks that extended far beyond Portland's elite private schools. Federal investigations triggered by David's evidence had uncovered similar operations in 12 states, resulting in over 40 arrests and the complete restructuring of oversight systems for educational institutions receiving public funding. Tyler Morrison, now 18 and facing his 2nd year in federal prison, had become an unlikely catalyst for educational reform. His recorded confession, played during congressional hearings, had shocked lawmakers into passing the Educational Integrity Act legislation that created federal protections for teachers who reported academic fraud and established criminal penalties for systematic grade manipulation. Tyler Morrison received a 10-year sentence for conspiracy, attempted arson, and civil rights violations. David continued, his words carrying across the silent auditorium. But his real punishment was discovering that actions have consequences, regardless of your family's bank account. Jake Sullivan had received 8 years, his sentence reduced because of cooperation with federal investigators that exposed corruption in college recruiting programs across the Pacific Northwest. Alex Hartwell, the strategic mastermind whose social media obsession had provided crucial evidence, was serving 6 years while his family's investment firm faced federal racketeering charges. But the 3 teenagers were small fish compared to the adults who'd enabled their behavior. Richard Morrison had received 25 years for operating what prosecutors called the most sophisticated educational corruption network in American history. His business empire had been dismantled, with assets seized to compensate victims and fund educational integrity programs. The Morrison family thought they were buying influence, David explained to the conference audience. What they actually purchased was a federal investigation that exposed systematic corruption reaching from high school classrooms to state education departments. Dr. Harrison Blackwell had received 15 years for accepting bribes and falsifying academic records. Margaret Sullivan faced 12 years for conspiracy and abuse of public trust. Even Dr. Rivera, the district superintendent who'd placed David on administrative leave, was serving 8 years for her role in the cover-up principle. Alina Martinez had avoided prison by cooperating fully with investigators, but her career in education was over. She now worked as a victim advocate, helping teachers and families who'd suffered retaliation for reporting academic fraud. Her transformation from enabler to advocate had surprised everyone, including David. The most important lesson from the Morrison case, David continued, isn't that corruption was exposed and punished. It's that the system itself has been transformed to prevent future abuse. Lincoln High School had become a model for educational integrity, implementing transparency protocols that made grade manipulation virtually impossible. Every assignment, test score, and academic decision was now documented in systems that parents, students, and oversight agencies could access in real time. The school's new principal, Dr. Michael Chun, no relation to David despite the shared surname, had been recruited specifically because of his reputation for ethical leadership and innovative educational practices. Under his guidance, Lincoln High had gone from a school ruled by wealthy families to an institution focused on academic excellence and equal opportunity. "We've created what we call the Glass Classroom Initiative," Dr. Chun had explained during a recent interview. "Every aspect of the educational process is transparent and accountable. Parents can track their children's progress, teachers can document their methods, and administrators can ensure that decisions are based on educational merit rather than financial influence." The initiative had spread to over 300 schools nationwide, supported by federal funding and legislation inspired by the Morrison case. David had been invited to help design the protocols, bringing his investigative experience to bear on creating systems that prevented corruption rather than simply detecting it after the fact. But David's greatest satisfaction came from the personal transformations he'd witnessed in the months following the arrests. Marcus Rodriguez had returned to teaching, hired by the Seattle Public School District to help implement their new integrity protocols. Sandra Park's daughter Lisa had graduated with honors from Portland State University and landed a job with the FBI's white-collar crime unit, specifically assigned to educational corruption cases. "Lisa Park is now Agent Park," David told the conference audience, "investigating corruption cases across the country. She turned her family's victimization into a career dedicated to protecting other families from similar abuse." Sandra Park herself had been offered a position at Lincoln High, replacing the literature teacher who'd been complicit in the Morrison family's grade manipulation schemes. Her first act had been to establish a student advocate program that gave students confidential channels for reporting academic fraud or intimidation. Even some of the former enablers had found redemption through accountability. Several teachers who'd inflated grades under Morrison family pressure had kept their jobs by testifying honestly about the coercion they'd faced. The federal investigation had revealed that most educators had been victims rather than willing participants in the corruption network. "The Morrison case taught us that corruption succeeds when good people feel isolated and powerless," David explained. "Our new systems ensure that teachers, students, and parents have multiple channels for reporting problems and protecting whistleblowers from retaliation." David's own career had taken unexpected turns since his reinstatement as a teacher. The Department of Education had recruited him to lead their new Educational Integrity Division, a federal agency tasked with investigating and preventing systematic corruption in American schools. He'd accepted the position on the condition that he could continue teaching part-time, maintaining his connection to classroom education. His classes at Lincoln High had become legendary among students and parents. Not because David was an easy grader, quite the opposite, but because he'd created an environment where academic achievement was based purely on effort and understanding rather than family connections or financial influence. "Mr. Chun doesn't care if your parents are rich or poor," current student Michael Torres had written in a recent evaluation. "He cares if you do the work and learn the material. For the first time in my high school career, I know that my grades actually mean something." David's personal life had also been transformed by the events of the previous year. His courage in standing up to the Morrison family had attracted the attention of Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the investigative reporter who'd helped expose the corruption network. Their professional collaboration had evolved into something deeper, and they'd married in a small ceremony attended by many of the teachers and families who'd been victimized by Morrison intimidation. "Jennifer and I bonded over our shared commitment to exposing corruption and protecting innocent people," David had explained to the Oregonian in a recent interview. We discovered that fighting for justice together was a pretty solid foundation for a relationship. But perhaps the most significant transformation had occurred in David himself. The anger and guilt that had driven him from law enforcement had been replaced by a sense of purpose and accomplishment. He'd found a way to use his tactical skills and investigative experience in service of education rather than enforcement, protecting students and teachers instead of pursuing criminals. For 12 years, I thought my police career was about catching bad guys, David told the conference audience. But I learned that my real calling was protecting good people from those who would abuse their power and position. The Morrison case had also triggered broader societal changes beyond education. Congress had passed legislation requiring transparency in all institutions receiving federal funding, creating accountability standards for nonprofits, hospitals, and community organizations. The principle that wealth couldn't buy exemption from rules had been codified into law across multiple sectors of American society. Tyler Morrison's recorded confession had become required viewing in civics classes nationwide, used to teach students about the importance of integrity and the consequences of believing that money could solve every problem. His fall from privileged teenager to federal prisoner served as a powerful warning about the dangers of unchecked entitlement. Tyler Morrison thought he was untouchable, David explained. What he discovered was that in America, when institutions work correctly, no one is above the law regardless of their family's wealth or influence. Jake Sullivan's transformation had been the most dramatic of the three original conspirators. Prison had forced him to confront the toxic masculinity and blind loyalty that had made him Tyler's enforcer. Through therapy and education programs, he'd developed genuine remorse for his actions and a commitment to preventing other young men from making similar mistakes. Upon his release, Jake planned to work with at-risk youth, using his experience to help kids understand that true strength came from protecting others rather than intimidating them. His victim impact statement had moved even federal prosecutors to tears as he detailed the psychological manipulation that had turned him into Tyler's weapon. Alex Hartwell's fate had been less redemptive, but equally instructive. His compulsive need to document everything had provided prosecutors with overwhelming evidence, but his fundamental narcissism had prevented genuine rehabilitation. He remained convinced that he'd been unfairly targeted for behavior that he characterized as normal business practices. Alex Hartwell represents the danger of wealth without wisdom, David observed. Even facing years in prison, he couldn't understand that documenting criminal activity on social media wasn't strategic, it was stupid. As David concluded his keynote address, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from a suspended teacher fighting for his career to a national advocate for educational integrity. The Morrison case had cost him months of stress and uncertainty, but it had also revealed possibilities he'd never imagined. 6 months ago, I was a teacher under investigation, fighting false charges and facing the destruction of my career, David said, his voice carrying across the packed auditorium. Today, I stand before you as proof that one person standing up for what's right can transform entire systems. The standing ovation that followed lasted for several minutes, but David was already thinking about his next class at Lincoln High School. Tomorrow, he would return to room 127 to teach a lesson about the American Revolution, discussing how ordinary people had stood up to seemingly overwhelming power and changed the course of history. His students would learn about taxation without representation, about colonial resistance to British tyranny, and about the principles that founded American democracy. But they would also learn, through David's own example, that those principles remained alive and relevant in the 21st century. As David left the conference and headed home to Portland, he received a text message from one of his current students. Mr. Chun, thank you for teaching us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite being afraid. See you in class tomorrow. David smiled as he read the message, understanding that his greatest victory wasn't the destruction of the Morrison family's corruption network, or his national recognition as an advocate for educational integrity. His greatest victory was the knowledge that he'd helped create a generation of students who understood that they were never as powerless as they believed, and that standing up for what's right was always worth the cost. The war against corruption in education would continue, fought by teachers, students, and parents who refused to accept that wealth could buy exemption from accountability. But thanks to one former SWAT commander who'd refused to back down from 3 spoiled teenagers, that war now had weapons, strategies, and legal protections that made victory possible. In classrooms across America, teachers could now speak truth without fear, students could report misconduct without retaliation, and families could trust that academic achievement would be based on merit rather than money. The Morrison case had ended not just with individual justice, but with systemic transformation that protected future generations from the kind of corruption that had once seemed unstoppable. David Chun had proven that sometimes the most peaceful thing you could do was teach others to fight, not with fists or weapons, but with integrity, courage, and the unshakable belief that in America, justice was still possible for those brave enough to demand it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.